We are in our lesson, but before we go any further, I would like to invite you to log on with your devices, laptops, smartphones, tablets. Why logging on? Because we have an assessment before our lesson ends. So I would want you to be logged on time, and then when you get to the time of doing our assessment, you will all be ready. So login details, www.hellosmart.com, and you sign in as our guest. You type in the ID. The ID is 598751. I'm sure I'm very clear. I did put it in red. And I would want to invite you to use your name. For today, use your real name too as you log in. I would want to address you as your real name. If you're Bongani, I know Bongani will be logged on. So those are our details. I'm giving you a few moments to log on. We have got an assessment. Today is a short one. It's a 5-question assessment at the end, which I would want you to attempt. So we need our logon details. All right, I'm sure you are logged on. Right, let's move on to our lesson, CAPS aligned lesson. As I've said, it's sponsored to us by VT Africa. Okay, we are starting on term 2 work. Term 2 starts on topic 5. Topic 5 is genetics and inheritance. I love this topic, and I'm sure you guys, you know the importance of genetics and inheritance as part of our overall end of year assessment. Why is it important? It carries a greater weight on your assessment. You know, genetics does not carry the same weight as the endocrine system. As an example, it carries more weight. And I always say to my learners, we need to collect all the marks when it comes to genetics and inheritance. And indeed, if we walk through the same journey together, we will get all the marks when it comes to genetics and inheritance. Are we together? Lesson 9 of our topic covers inheritance and variation. So for today, we are going to look at inheritance and variation. However, we do not, as in many subjects, we don't learn our topics in isolation. It doesn't mean that we are covering inheritance today and variation. We put a line, then we cover Mendel's laws, we put a line. No, they do overlap. So inheritance and variation is the lesson for today. Right. To start our lesson, let's look at vocabulary that we will be using within our whole topic. So let me emphasize this. Do not cram the definitions. You won't master what you are supposed to master, and especially when it comes to genetics and inheritance. Of course, you can be questioned in a formative assessment to define, for example, incomplete dominance, or to define a phenotype. But that doesn't mean that when you are starting, you have to cram the definition. If you cram the definition, I assure you, you wouldn't be able to solve other problems on dihybrid inheritance and monohybrid inheritance, because you only cram the definition, but you do not master the concept of what we mean by a genotype, of what we mean by a phenotype, as an example. So please know the definition, but don't cram them. Are we together? Right. So we look at terms like alleles, antigen, codominance, complete dominance, incomplete dominance, dominant allele, first generation, which we refer to as F1, genotype, heredity, monohybrid inheritance, and the rest of them, pure breeding and all them. We are not going to encounter or mention all of them in our lesson 9. Remember, the other following lesson. Are we together? So, let me repeat, do not cram the definition. Let us understand what they mean. That's what we are doing. That's what I will help you to go through. Thank you. After every topic, we have got introduction to genetics and inheritance. Then we have a shorter formative assessment. Same applies to Mendel's complete dominance model. We have a formative assessment, right? Until we come to dihybrid crosses, we do have some assessments that we need to go through, right? Let's look at our lesson for today. Introduction to genetics and inheritance. What comes into our mind when somebody says we are talking about genetics and inheritance? What comes into your mind? What do you think? All right. Genetics refers to the study of heredity. Maybe some will say, what is Sidney saying? He's telling us genetics, then he defined it as heredity. So how then do I understand it? Let's try to simplify it with examples. In our human nature, or in our animal kingdom, as someone to say, even in plant kingdoms, we do inherit genetic materials from our parents. Remember, we are produced sexually. Even if you are produced asexually, you still inherit traits from your parents to yourself. And then when you become a parent, like me, not you great hopes, you also have your chance to pass on your genetic material to your offsprings. Good. So how traits such as, for an example, hair color and increased risk of specific diseases are passed from one generation to the other? How does it go about? Remember, from your first term work, you need to understand or to revisit your DNA, your chromosomes, your meiosis, your mitosis, because it's a link. They would take us from there and help us to understand our genetics and introduction. So if you have forgotten about your last topic, from last term, visit it. We need to recap on your protein synthesis, the translation, the transcriptions, what is involved. It will help us to understand our genetics. Good. So DNA is arranged as chromosomes. We remember that, each containing specific genes. And you do have how many copies of a gene? We remember that. We do have how many copies? Always 2 copies of each gene. In other words, I possess 2 copies of each gene. Where does one come from? The mother, the other one from the father. Hence, we do have 2 copies. I'm sure, as I said, you remember your process of meiosis, having the chromosome, so that I donate half, you receive half from your partner, then the 2 copies will complement each other. Good. It takes us to phenotypes and genotypes. Right. Remember, I said we do not cram definitions. Here we've got phenotypes and genotypes. How do we go about it? Where are they coming from? Right. Remember, we mentioned copies, that gene has 2 copies from my previous slide. And the 2 copies of the same gene are what we refer to as alleles. Don't worry, it will get more clearer as we cover the topic. But 2 copies of the same gene, we refer to them as alleles. And they both code. Remember, code. I said, remember your protein synthesis? They code for the same type of trait. But however, it might be expressed differently. What do we mean? when we take our trait as the color of eyes, which means the gene that codes for the color of eyes becomes our trait. But the color could be brown, the color could be blue, as an example, right? So your DNA or your genetic, apologies, or your genetic composition okay, your DNA which is your genetic composition, is what we refer to as the genotype. What makes you up intrinsically, if I may say so. I hope we are together. What makes you up? Your DNA, remember your double helix that we did last term, is what is referred to as your genotype. All right. Your genotype causes proteins to be produced. And or when and how much of that particular protein is produced. Remember, I said you should revisit your protein synthesis if you've forgotten, so that we then be on the same wagon. Proteins from the basis of, they form the basis of our traits. Whatever we are is determined by the type of protein that would have been produced. Any variation in protein production will affect phenotype. Any variation, any change, any variation, any change will affect the production and ultimately the phenotype. All right, I'll immediately describe what we mean by phenotype. What do we mean by phenotype, which is determined by the genotype? Are we together? Grade 12? Thank you. For an example, you might have an allele for blue eyes and an allele for brown eyes. The trait here or the gene here is the eye color, which can be either blue, though I'm underlying it with green, it can be either blue or brown. So the eye color is the genotype, but the color that we then see becomes the phenotype. So although we have both alleles, your eyes are brown. The question asks why. I'm carrying both the genotype for brown and for blue. But what do we see? As an example, we see, let me highlight it. We see do I have brown? I'm sure I do have brown. Let's pick brown. Okay. We see brown eyes, and that's the phenotype. So how does it happen that I do have the genotype for both blue and for brown, but I resemble brown? What happens to my blue phenotypic traits that I carry? That's the question. So in this lesson, we are going to solve that. How and why only one allele is expressed. Are we together, grade 12s? Wonderful. Right, as I've said, we are going to check in this lesson why we can have a situation of an example, why only brown eyes are exhibited on myself, but genotypically I do carry an allele for blue as well. What determines who is expressed? Let's look at the definition again, and I want to emphasize, to not cram it. The more we talk about it, the more we also read on yourselves, you would appreciate what they mean. So remember we said genes, 2 copies. So those 2 copies, which may alternate, in this an example, brown or blue, that's what we call alleles. Alternative forms of the genes that, correct, use this, alternative forms of the same genes that occur in the same place on the chromosomes. It's very important. We do not have alleles on different positions on our chromosomes. They occupy the same place. When we meet after grade 12 at your tertiary, we can throw in terms like locus. They occupy the same locus. For now, let's keep it simple. They occupy the same place on the chromosomes. Right. Let's try to make sense from genotype again. Genotype from the term is the genotypic composition, and it's given by the combination of the 2 alleles. And ultimately, the genotype would determine the physical appearance of an organism. I can say I'm short. The composition that I carry for height, that's my gene, have made me to be short. Or maybe I can say I'm moderately short. I'm in between being high and being tall. So phenotype, what we see, is the physical appearance of an organism. Are we together? Grade 12s. Let's again master this and not cram. Traits or physical appearance of an organism. Wonderful. I hope I'm not too fast for you. Let's move on to the next slide. Right. After having covered the gene, the alleles, the phenotype, and the genotype, we now want to appreciate their behavior in us. That determines that if I'm carrying 2 genotypes, so if I'm carrying my 2 alleles for my same genotype, using our same example of eye color, how then can I appear? How then does it influence my physical appearance, which is your phenotype? Are we following? That's why we come to 2 terms, dominant and recessive. So one of my alleles can be dominant, the other one can be recessive. Who can tell me who between the 2 of dominant and the recessive will be expressed when I'm carrying either dominant or recessive? That's what we should look at. Right. Here we say for a complete dominant, for a complete dominance inheritance models, alleles can be classified as dominant or recessive. On my first vocabulary, I ran through them. There was dominance, there was incomplete dominance, there was the term that said co-dominance. Without confusing you, for now, let's restrict ourselves to the explanation that is coming from complete. Let me say complete. We are very much worried about complete. Right. I hope I'm not blocking it. Complete dominance. We'll look at co-dominance. We'll look at incomplete dominance. But for us to understand the two terms, dominant and recessive, let's start with complete dominance. If we master it, it would help us now to understand co-dominance or incomplete dominance. Are we together, grade 12s? So what is the situation when the allele is dominant? Who can tell me? A dominant allele produces a phenotype in an organism, even if the individual has one copy of that allele. A recessive trait is only expressed as a phenotype when both alleles are present. Let me underline these terms. They will guide us. They will help us. We would need them. When an organism carry one. Sorry, I want to use a pen. I want to use a pen. It's all right. I need to give my body some time to process what I'm saying. I mustn't be too ahead of it, otherwise it would say, you are confusing me, Sydney. Sorry for confusing you. Let me not confuse you. Great. I want to use a pen, the red one, because this would help us to understand moving forward. Dominant, even if, remember for us to be able to express, us in the term of the genes, to express ourselves is the work of the genes. So we don't need to get confused. We need to master it as we go. Right. I was saying we are much worried about these two terms. One, for dominant, it can be expressed. For recessive, both alleles, which means two of them have to be present. Two of them has to be present for the trait to be expressed. That is very important. The allele for albinism, as an example, is a recessive trait, which means two recessive traits of albinism has to be expressed for one to be an albino as the phenotype. Are we following? So in my example there, the child is carrying two recessive albinism alleles as the genotype for him to be phenotypically an albino. And this is what we call complete dominance. So the recessive allele for albinism, for it to be expressed within my example here, it has to be carrying two of the traits to be an albino. We shall look at another example where you carry just one copy, then you exhibit the dominant trait. Right, let's summarize these three terms. Complete dominance, then dominant allele, and recessive allele. I have said one allele is dominant and the other is recessive. That's the nature of our alleles. One can be dominant, one can be recessive. Are we happy with this one only? It's very important for us to master it. One allele is dominant and the other is recessive. Remember from the introduction, we inherit this from one parent. So you might inherit a dominant, you might inherit a recessive. Are we together? What do? They determine the phenotype. The alleles for albinism is determining what we are seeing as our phenotype. Good. Dominant allele expressed is the allele that is expressed and determines the phenotype, even if one of it is carried. The recessive allele, an allele that is only expressed when two copies of the same allele are present. Loud and clear? Thank you so much, grade 12. Let's move on. I'm sure we're right on time. Let's look at the next item. Here we go. A simple example of dominant and recessiveness. You see how COVID is so disruptive to our everyday life. I have an example here of tongue rolling. You can't do it in class because of the COVID. It's saying here, look at your classmates. Of course, our mask has to be on, but then we can't be able to do it practically. Please don't do it, but we can just follow. Here is the example. If you look at my example, tongue rolling is dominant over non-tongue rolling. Tongue rolling is dominant over non-tongue rolling. I'm summarizing what is here. So for you to be able to roll your tongue, you should be carrying the dominant allele of the gene that determines tongue rolling. That determines you as a tongue roller or a non-tongue roller. If you are following, my first example here should be carrying at least one of the dominant genes for tongue rolling. It will make clear on my next example. I'm taking you stage by stage. She cannot. So in this case, this one is a dominant allele for tongue rolling. This one is she's carrying the recessive allele for tongue rolling. Hence, she cannot roll a tongue. Wonderful. You will try when you get home, to see if you are a tongue roller or a non-tongue roller. Right. Let's come to the scientific method of expressing or writing our genotypes. Geneticists use a special code to present or to represent genotypes. We use our letters of the alphabet to represent genes. So here I have said the gene that codes for a specific trait symbolized by a letter, dominant, is always represented by the uppercase of the letter. So automatically it means recessiveness is represented by the lowercase. Uppercase, my grade 12 is the capital letter, lowercase is the small letter. But I'm contradicting myself slightly, not much. I said you can choose any letter. That makes sense. It's not very correct. Let me say, choose any letter that makes sense but does not confuse you. You see, I said for an example, let's use T, the caps, which means that represent the dominant allele, and the small t would represent the recessive allele. Right. I have said here, choose any two, but I want to say choose letters of the alphabet in which the uppercase and the lowercase are structurally different. If you pick your letter as X for the uppercase and then X for the smaller case, does it work? You see, as we begin to solve problems on your monohybrid and dihybrid, such letters will confuse you. You will be confused. You'll be busy writing, and I'll be saying, 10 minutes to go, that's an exam. You do not know who is who at the end of the day. So do not choose letters which have got the same structure. That's my advice. You can't pick S and S. They are the same. W and W. Of course, you find some texts they do it, but I want to discourage you. Let's pick letters that do not have the same structure of the uppercase and the lowercase great proofs. Are we together? You can pick any letter to represent a trait, but you find out that as you'll be solving some problems, normally the traits would guide you on the letter to choose, but absolutely there's no link. You can choose B to represent height. You can choose T to represent color. Don't say because you're talking about color, then I can take C and C. It's dangerous. Are we together? So we use letters to represent dominance, dominance or recessiveness of an allele. Are we together? I hope so. Let's move on to the next slide. What does it talk about? It's still continuing. So here, remember we said, or you can say, I said in the first slide, a gene always 2 copies. So each time we represent the genotype, we should use 2 copies, which means allele 1 and allele 2. Are we following? So we represent them using letters of the alphabet, which I have just said. I would advise you to choose those letters which are different, the uppercase and the lowercase in terms of structure, like my T. I don't like the X's, the S's, the C's because they look the same. Right. So now we are further simplifying our dominance and recessiveness. Learners with phenotype of tongue rollers, our previous example, can either have a genotype TT and TT. T uppercase, T mixture. And remember, if you remember from the previous slide, there was a statement that says even if one of the letters is present. So in this case, dominance is shown. She was a tongue roller, and that's what we see. She can roll a tongue, but a phenotype could appear in 2 different forms. She could be carrying the TT or the TT. She appears as a tongue roller. Why? Because tongue rolling is dominant over non-tongue rolling. So the moment I carry a dominant allele, even if the other one I'm carrying is a recessive, I will still exhibit the dominance phenotype. Complete dominance. Tongue rolling is completely dominant over non-tongue rolling. That's where it is coming from. That's where you have to master your term complete dominance. So tongue lolling is a dominant form of the trait, correct? And only one dominant allele is needed for the gene to be expressed. We'll find out how we describe these two situations when we introduce the next term. But for now, it's very important to note that in complete dominance, as long as one of the alleles is dominant and then the other one being recessive, the phenotype will always what be? Dominant. Wonderful, grade 12. So, very important to note, in complete dominance, only the recessive trait form is exhibited with 2 copies of the same gene. So the other lady, my machine is slow in changing the slides, so that will be on the same pace with me. I won't go back. But for you to be recessive, we have to be having 2 recessive alleles. That's what we have said. Let's move on to the next item. Right. Terms are keep on coming. Homozygous and heterozygous. We are now describing the alleles. Please remember I said my topic feeds into one another. Don't say I've covered dominant, I've covered recessiveness. That's done. Now I'm talking about homozygous and heterozygous. No, it's a link. You still remember homo is a prefix and means the same. Homo means the same. Hetero means different. So homozygous individuals, homo means same, which means you have got 2 same alleles. In my previous example, when I was showing about dominance and recessiveness, you are not homozygous if you are carrying a recessive small t and a dominant t. You are heterozygous. If you are carrying 2 big T's for tongue rolling, you are homozygous. That's only what we are talking about. Apologies. That's what we are talking about. Thank you. Great curves. Right. So, in short, your genotype and phenotype depend on the type of alleles that you inherit from your parents. Are we together? This statement is what it is saying. It depends on what you pick. Okay. Even if we do not cover the whole content of our today's lesson, it will be fine. As long as we kickstart it, we understand as we go. Right. Allow me to come back to this. When we meet tomorrow. I don't want you to confuse you by now doing some crosses. For now, I want you to understand the introduction, the terminologies. I will come back to this one on the when you are doing hormone hybrid inheritance. So homozygous, 2 alleles of the dominant type. Heterozygous, 2 alleles of different, 2 alleles of different, one being dominant, the other one being recessive. But however, because of the nature of complete dominance, if you're having a heterozygous condition as your genotype, you exhibit the dominant phenotype. Good. If you remember the structure of your chromosomes, this is what we've been talking about, to emphasize homozygous. Remember, we said we use letters to represent our alleles. Homozygous, same in structure and shape. The moment the shape is different, it's not a homozygous, it's not the same. And remember, we said genes occupy the same position. So the gene for tongue rolling occupy the same position on our chromosomes. Same position. Maybe this one will be occupying height. Maybe this one will be occupying color. This one may be occupying something else. But genes do occupy the same position on our chromosomes. Allow me to conclude by emphasizing these 2 points. Homozygous condition can be in the dominant form. Homozygous condition can be in the recessive form. The albino was homozygous, recessive. The non-tongue lorer, homozygous, recessive. The moment you are hetero, which means both. You see, you can be hetero, carrying the dominant on this part of the gene or on this part of the gene, you still be a tongue roller in this case. So hetero, but generally we write it as on most occasions. It is not wrong to write it this way, but when you are now solving our monohybrid scenarios and dihybrid, we normally always want to use this format. Wonderful. So let's move on to our assessment, a quick one. It will help us to recap the whole lesson before the time lapses. Right, here we go. Right, I'm happy we did manage to cover all we wanted to cover. Right, first question. I'm sure that's why we logged on at the beginning of the lesson. Now let's quickly move on to the assessment. Let's log on and see who is joining us. First question. The term that describes any organism's trait and appearance. What term do we use to describe the organism's trait or appearance? I haven't gone far ahead of you. We are starting now. Let me give you time to log on. Let's start the activity. I'm sure we have people joining us already. That's quite pleasing. Lloyd has joined us. Candice has joined us. That's wonderful. Right. So, number one, quick one. Again, let me repeat it for you. For those who are not joined in, don't worry, we have the information. What is the term that describes an organism's trait or appearance? Good. Should we find the answer now or at the end? Let's find the answer. Okay. The answer is the appearance, is the phenotype. All right. Did you get it right? Let's move on to the next question before our time lapses. We are almost done. All right. Thank you. Time is jealous. We will do the next questions. I will send to you as homework and then we can cover them together. Thank you so much, grade 12s. Let's meet tomorrow. Our next lesson is